The United States of America possesses 3.797 million square miles of diverse territories, lending astounding levels of diversity from one state to the next. But for every beautiful landmark the US has to offer, there's something downright strange just around the corner. Locations that would make any traveler, or even a native, question exactly how it all came to be. In this video, we'll be taking a look at 25 of the country's geographic oddities that continue to befuddle the average Americanophile, yes, that's a real word, as well as the reason they stand today. Have you ever noticed this disconnected piece of Minnesota? Known as the Northwest Angle, it is one of only 6 non-island hotspots identified as practical exclaves, a part of one country that can only be entered via land route by passing through another country, which in this case is Canada. The area of this chimney is approximately 596.3 miles, with 473.2 miles of that being water. Additionally, it is the northernmost point of the contiguous 48 states. So how did this territory, that requires Canadian approval to drive there, end up being a piece of the United States? Well, it came about from a misunderstanding of the region's geography. According to historians, Benjamin Franklin and British representatives relied on the Mitchell map, which did not indicate the source of the Mississippi River, thought to lie some distance to the northwest, or the true shape of the Lake of the Woods, which was instead shown as roughly oval. During future treaties, such as the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, the British suggested carving out a new boundary to run west of Lake Superior to Lake Itasca, the actual headwaters of Mississippi. Unfortunately, at this point in time, the love of expansion was already a part of the US's modus operandi, and there was no way they would consider giving up land, as there was a fear that this would set a precedent for all future negotiations. So the Northwest Angle, or simply Angle, as the locals call it, is here to stay. Our next stop is this town here, Carter Lake. At first glance, you'd probably assume this is just another Nebraskan town that lies near the border of Iowa. But the reality is, it's actually a part of Iowa. But unlike the Northwest Angle, which is clearly separated from the rest of Minnesota by water, why is this town an exclave of Iowa? The lake to the north, from which the town gets its name, was born in 1877 after a flood changed the course of the Missouri River 1¼ miles to the southeast. The development led to an arduous litigation process between Iowa and Nebraska, where the Supreme Court ruled that Carter Lake belonged to Iowa. What makes this so unique is that this defies the general rule that state boundaries follow the changes in the river. As a result, in July 1930, Carter Lake was incorporated as a city, hosting 2 amusement parks in the early 20th century, as well as becoming a place to gamble in the 30s and 40s with limited law enforcement. Thanks, Mother Nature. Now, quick, let me ask you this. Which US state is closest to Africa? Most map enthusiasts might assume that it's Florida, about 4,085 miles from Gujarat. On top of that, Florida's climate just makes you think that it would have to be Africa's closest oceanic neighbor in the States. Alas, you would be wrong. It actually happens to be Maine. More specifically, a peninsula in the state known as Quoddy Head, which sounds like something out of Moby Dick. This little lighthouse settlement is at the easternmost point in the US, 3,154 miles from El Bedouza, a rural commune in Morocco, just over 900 miles closer than Florida. Known for its rocky coastline and lobster shacks, the cool state of Maine seems like an odd location to be closest to the cradle of civilization, and yet, here we are. Just south of Maine, we arrive at New York City, which has a rather unique governmental structure. As you may know, New York City is made up of 5 boroughs. For the uninitiated, these boroughs are titled Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island. Each borough is also equal to the county boundaries of the same name. This group of counties cover a relatively small 322 square miles of land, and yet each of these societal pockets possesses its own class system and culture. Manhattan acts as the seat of wealth, housing most of the territory's skyscrapers, multinational corporations, Wall Street, and the headquarters of the UN. Brooklyn, on the western tip of Long Island, is the most populated out of the 5, and known for its diversity and thriving art scene. Queens is the largest of them all. Founded by the Dutch, it has reached major commercial success, inspiring countless TV shows and movies. The Bronx is home to Yankee Stadium and home to the largest metropolitan zoo in the world. Lastly, Staten Island boasts unobstructed views of the Statue of Liberty along 28 miles of trails and the Greenbelt. But the strange thing about this layout is that the government of New York City as an entity supersedes the authority of each individual county. So while county leadership would supersede a city in the other 49 states, New York City is the exception. Traveling to the Midwest, take a look at the Missouri boot heel, a salient or elongated protrusion that makes it look like Missouri has begun leaking into Arkansas. The rest of Missouri's southern border is a straight line. So what happened here? Up until the 20th century, the district was utilized for wheat and was full of family farms, until the invasion of the notorious boll weevil, a beetle that decimated the territory and sent everyone packing. Surprisingly, this little piece of land was home to a number of Civil War battles too, and was a hotbed for civil rights conflicts during the 1910s. But originally, the Missouri boot heel wasn't supposed to be included as part of Missouri. During the formation of the Missouri Compromise, the original border was supposed to be a simple extension connected to Kentucky and Tennessee. But a man by the name of John Hardman Walker didn't like the sound of that idea. He had grown up in the territory, and after many had fled following the New Madrid earthquakes in 1811, Walker continued to buy land to expand his cattle business. This led to him eventually being known as the Czar of the Valley. By 1818, Congress was brought into a dialogue with Walker and the local residents. Walker, who preferred the area and his holdings to be under the protection of Missouri state laws, lobbied in Missouri and Washington, D.C. for inclusion of the boot heel within the boundaries of the state of Missouri. On March 6, 1820, the Missouri Territory requested admission into the Union with the modified boundary. The request was accepted and increased the total area of Missouri by 980 square miles. Going from one salient to another, it's time to talk about another iconic geographical oddity, the Florida Panhandle. Bordering Alabama at about 200 miles in length, this panhandle is one of only 8 that can be found in the United States. The 10 counties that inhabit the space are not only separated culturally, with French influence being a common theme, but they inhabit a separate time zone from the rest of the state, using Central Time. Well, except Gulf County, which is split in 2 by the Central and Eastern time zones. But how did the Florida Panhandle come into existence, and why wasn't it just included as part of Alabama? The journey started in 1811, while the Panhandle was still a part of Spain. But American settlers in the territory found themselves closely identifying with the U.S. and sent a petition to Congress asking to be incorporated into the Mississippi Territory. But this more or less fell on deaf ears. In 1819, the Constitutional Convention of Alabama asked to join what was then known as West Florida to the new state. Again, no such luck. Finally, in 1821, Spain decided it was in their best interest to sell the territory. At that point, the Panhandle counties finally became a part of Florida, which was admitted as a state in 1845. Quite the roller coaster, but here it stands today. Geography has its high points and low points. In this case, literally and figuratively. Another fascinating oddity lies in the state of California. California is one of the few places where 5 major climate types occur in close proximity. Here, the desert, cool interior, highland, and steppe climates border a smaller region of Mediterranean climate. Half of all produce comes from the state's varietal landscape, so it may come as no surprise that there are many peaks and valleys to visit as a traveler. In this particular instance, the peak we're talking about today is Mount Whitney, a 14,505-foot monster of a mountain and the culminating summit of the Sierra Nevadas. Its neighbor, sitting only 85 miles apart from the high peak, is the Badwater Basin in Death Valley, sitting at 282 feet below sea level. What makes this fascinating, or odd, is that these are the highest and lowest points of the contiguous United States. The country is about 3,000 miles wide, so the fact that Mount Whitney and Badwater sit so close to each other is one of the craziest natural coincidences on this list. Across the US, there's a clear hierarchy with the government. You have cities that are part of counties, which make up states, which fall under the federal government in DC. So it may surprise some to know that one state decided this hierarchy didn't apply to them. That state is Virginia. But why? Well, it's a fairly complicated matter that can be traced back to the time of the colonies, when the British were trying to encourage the creation of towns in order to better extract taxes from their subjects. It was a feudal gesture, and Virginia's General Assembly held numerous meetings in an attempt to resolve the issue in later years. The issue often stemmed from a lack of population density. Finally, after World War I, Alexandria County was the first in Virginia to have sufficient population density for local officials to provide public services equivalent to towns and cities. The Supreme Court of Appeals ruled in 1922 that towns could not be created in Arlington County, and its territory could not be annexed by the adjacent city of Alexandria. So, Arlington County was to be treated as an independent city, and it was the first county in the United States to adopt the county manager form of government. Fast forward to the present day, and many Virginia cities statewide are completely separate from counties when it comes to jurisdiction. City residents resolve legal disputes in separate courts from county residents. Cities and counties have separate land use and transportation plans, and in almost every case, separate school systems as well. In the end, Virginia was going to do it their own way. Moving further south, Texas is another member of the United States that definitely marches to the beat of its own drum. As the second largest member of the Union, it spans 268,596 square miles, nearly 3 times bigger than the whole of the UK. Formerly a part of Mexico, Texas had actually become an independent country in 1836, leaving it quite a bit of time to develop its own identity until it joined the US in 1845. From rodeos to 10-gallon hats to its iconic Lone Star flag, Texas's presence looms so large that many on the outside believe Texans and Americans in general are one and the same. All of this aside, although many see Texas as the champion of the South, some might be astonished to know just how South Texas actually is. In fact, if you look at a map of deep South Texas, you'll see its southernmost point dips almost as low as Miami. The port of Brownsville is almost a straight shot to the party capital, about 1,029 nautical miles through the Gulf of Mexico. At number 10, we'll be looking at another natural wonder, Crater Lake. Located in south-central Oregon, this volcanic crater lake is famous for its aesthetic alone, drawing in a number of cross-country enthusiasts with its rich blue color and up-close clarity. No rivers flow in or out of it, and it makes up for any loss of water through rainfall or snowmelt. It also houses 2 small islands, uniquely named Wizard Island, a 316-acre cinder cone, and a natural rock pillar called Phantom Ship. These facts are enough to catch one's attention, but the oddity lies in Crater Lake's depth. Although the body of water is only about 5 to 6 miles across, its maximum depth is 1,949 feet, making it the deepest lake in all of the United States. Excluding Lake Vostok in Antarctica, Crater Lake is cited as the 7th deepest lake on the planet. All of this is the product of volcanic activity from Mount Mazama. It's estimated that about 720 years was required to fill the lake to its present depth of 1,949 feet. Much of this occurred during a period when the prevailing climate was less moist than at present. Some hydrothermal activity remains along the lake floor, suggesting that at some time in the future, Mazama may erupt once again. With that said, Crater Lake is not the only mover and shaker on this list. When thinking about earthquakes, we often jump to highlighting activity on the West Coast in places like California. After all, there was a shock on April 10, 1906, off the Northern California coast that smashed City Hall and triggered a fire that scorched 28,000 buildings with a death toll that may have exceeded 3,000. For these reasons, many reasonably assume that the San Andreas Fault is an apocalyptic concern, inspiring a number of films like 2012 starring John Cusack. Believe it or not, the 2 biggest earthquakes in recorded US history, outside of Alaska, occurred far, far away from the San Andreas Fault. They actually took place in Missouri and South Carolina. Known as the New Madrid earthquakes, named after the New Madrid seismic zone, which was in turn named after the Mississippi River town of New Madrid. There was a series of quakes that occurred between 1811 and 1812. The first one hit a recorded magnitude of 7.2 to 8.2. At the time, their area was sparsely populated, so it didn't have the same effect as what took place in California. The last quake packed quite the punch though, shaking at a magnitude of 7.4 to 8.6. The town of New Madrid was destroyed. In St. Louis, Missouri, many houses were severely damaged and their chimneys were toppled. To this day, many eastern residents are warned that such an earthquake could come again in the next 50 or so years. Cleansing our palates, it's time to look at another panhandle. If you look closely at the northwest corner of the panhandle where Texas joins Oklahoma and New Mexico, you'll notice that the lines aren't perfectly aligned. After going down the edge of Oklahoma, the border goes 2.3 miles to the left before continuing in a straight line south. A couple miles is no big deal, right? Well, this is often referred to as the worst surveying error in United States history. Let's get a bit deeper here. This error actually goes far beyond the previously cited 2.3 miles. It actually gets bigger as it continues south, 310 miles to the bottom Texas-New Mexico corner, where it turns west and heads for El Paso. All totaled, the mistake accounts to a 942 square mile hiccup. To add insult to injury, all of this land should have technically gone to New Mexico. So, what happened? Well, in 1859, a man named John H. Clark was paid to survey and install monuments along what is called the 103rd Meridian, which aligns with where we see Oklahoma's border meet New Mexico today. Clark began on the southern end of today's Texas and New Mexico border, and made his way northward until he no longer had a water source. Sounds reasonable enough, but there was a small problem on top of this problem. While connecting the lines, he was frightened by the natives in the region and decided to stop 70 miles early. This leads us to the third problem though. Even if he wasn't running away, he still wouldn't have successfully drawn a connecting line. It turned out that his math was wrong, and he was off by the 2.3 miles we see on the map today. But it's more than that. When you calculate the narrow strip of land that should have been New Mexico, it amounts to 603,348 acres. But due to laziness or a lack of scrutiny, the boundary was accepted and certified in 1891. In 1910, when New Mexico was ready to become a state, the error was discovered, and New Mexico made a push to reclaim the territory. However, within the strip of land that would then become part of New Mexico was the XIT Ranch, whose primary investor, a man named John Farwell, was also a friend of then-President William Howard Taft. Not wanting to lose any land rights, Farwell successfully persuaded President Taft to tell New Mexico to leave the border as it was, or forget becoming a state entirely. New Mexico, understandably, backed down, and the border remained as it is today. Speaking of boundaries, some are just as deliberate as they are bizarre. For example, have you ever noticed that the top of Delaware is round? This is because of something known as the 12-mile circle, a circular arc that makes up the boundary between Delaware and Pennsylvania, extending out from the Delaware town of Newcastle. Like many oddities of the eastern United States, the start of this line dates back to King Charles II, who in 1681 granted a deed to William Penn. The circle was the product of the monarch's exception to accommodate the needs of the Duke of York, who had won the area after a victory against Dutch colonists. The Duke later gave the lands to Penn a year after the agreement. The circle isn't without controversy, though. Of note is the fact that the circle claims that the entirety of the Delaware River is part of Delaware's territory. Normally, a water border is split evenly down the middle, but this claim over the entire waterway has sparked government disagreements between Delaware and New Jersey ever since. Although the Supreme Court attempted to put these concerns to rest, they continue to battle over the odd boundary, with Delaware even going as far as to request the National Guard for security in the early 2000s. This, however, was ultimately a symbolic gesture. For the time being, though, it's clear that Delaware's claim to the river will stand. Sticking with Delaware for a moment longer, this is a case where physical and man-made geography meet. We're talking about the Delaware Peninsula, or Delmarva Peninsula depending on who you ask. Delmarva is an East Coast peninsula portmanteau made up of parts of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Although Delmarva is owned by 3 different governments who probably secretly wish to own it all themselves, it is a landmass that has since developed its own separate culture. In fact, many are quick to point out that Delmarva has a distinct accent and way of speaking. Additionally, there have been efforts by the people to secede, but these efforts have proven to be unsuccessful. If they ever managed to break away from the mainlanders, as they call them, the total population would be about 1.4 million, similar in size to Hawaii. This is one of those rare cases where separation does appear to make a bit of sense, considering that the people of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia appear to support their independence for a variety of reasons. Independence or not, Delmarva definitely deserves its place on this list. At number 15, take a look at this protruding piece of border on the northwest corner of Pennsylvania. In this area, we have what is known as the Erie Triangle, a 300 square mile piece of land that was a fairly hot-button issue between 5 states as well as Native American tribes. Each argued their claim to the land as it represented valuable access to the waters of Lake Erie. When Native American leaders heard of Pennsylvania's intent to access the land, they voiced their opposition, saying, "We must observe to you that we are sent in order to make peace, and that we are not authorized to stipulate any particular cession of lands." They also encouraged their people to actively oppose any attempts by American settlers to occupy the land. The opposition was not enough, however, and the U.S. government ultimately approved a sale of the land to Pennsylvania in 1792. The Native American tribes were paid $2,800 from Pennsylvania and $1,200 from the federal government. Unsurprisingly, this didn't placate the tribes' concerns, and conflict erupted in that region. But after the group's defeat by the United States Army in 1795, the tribes relented, and Pennsylvania's chimney was set in stone. Our next geographic oddity brings us to Bristol, a city split in half by the states of Virginia and Tennessee. In 1771, a trading post was constructed to serve travelers heading west for a better life. After about 1856, it reportedly prospered after the link between the Norfolk, Western, and Southern railways was finally joined. 2 communities were given city charters in 1890 with the name Bristol, triggering a pretty heated boundary dispute until 1901, when a line virtually halved the settlement along the center of State Street. Upon closer inspection, there are markers to indicate the separation, and the dispute, for the most part, ended amicably. Like Delmarva, both halves of Bristol share the same culture and quirks, with nothing separating them other than the invisible line separating all states in the Union. While some boundaries are fixed, other boundaries change by the season. Meet Maryland, a state well known for its extensive waterways, with a major historical seaport located in Baltimore. Due to its terraqueous nature, water rights take up a large portion of Maryland's legal disputes, especially when it comes to its boundary issues with Virginia. For decades, both states have entered numerous negotiations regarding control over the Potomac River, 400 miles long from its headwaters at North Branch to its mouth in the Chesapeake Bay. It ranks 48th among 135 U.S. rivers that are more than 100 miles long. The river is about 11 miles wide between Point Lookout and Smith Point. Ultimately, Maryland owns everything up to the low water mark on the Virginia side. What makes this especially strange is that rainfall essentially dictates how large Maryland is in a given year. If the season proves to be wet, the water level in the Potomac will rise, technically expanding the size of Maryland for the duration of that particular period. At number 18, we have another exclave. This time, it's the famous Kentucky Bend, a child of the Mississippi River, encircled by the states of Missouri and Tennessee. As of the 2020 census, the population was 9 persons in this area, tabulated as the Kentucky Bend Census County Division. The mailing address of the area is Tiptonville, Tennessee. New Madrid, Missouri is directly across the river to the north, but it isn't connected to the bend by road or ferry. Covering an area of 26.9 square miles, this little patch of land was given to Kentucky due to general uncertainty regarding the Mississippi River. Unlike the Erie Triangle or the New Mexico-Oklahoma border, nobody is 100% sure why the Kentucky Bend was drawn out in this exact way. There have been cases where Tennessee locals have disputed the validity of the bend, but overall, most people, including the residents of this oxbow loop-enclosed space, are confused about who rightfully owns it. In fact, Mark Twain references the Kentucky Bend in his book Life on the Mississippi, inspired by its peculiarity. As one can clearly see, many of these geographical oddities, however they initially came about, can be divisive for those living near or in them. In some cases, however, they can be a positive example of how people can make the best out of an inconvenient situation. For the most part, this seems to be the reality for the citizenry of Texarkana, a dual municipality astride the Texas-Arkansas boundary, United States. The city also lies near the Louisiana and Oklahoma state lines. First settled in 1874 at the junction of the Cairo and Fulton and the Texas and Pacific Railways, it derived its name from Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. With the rapid expansion of railways, markets were quick to collaborate with an expanding network, and the railroads were more than happy to oblige. The late 1850s saw builders working with the Cairo and Fulton Railroad enthusiastically pushing their lines south across Arkansas. Over the next half-century, rivalries formed between the builders, and eventually, the border was the logical juncture for growing railways. Today, Texas and Arkansas are divided by State Line Avenue, but they're still deeply connected economically and culturally. They even share a post office and courthouse. Next, we have ourselves an additional exclave called the Lost Peninsula. This small piece of Monroe County, in the southeasternmost corner of Michigan, spawned after the Toledo War boundary dispute in 1835 and 1836 to determine whether the state of Ohio or the Michigan Territory would control an area known as the Toledo Strip. Now, most people don't know this, but there have been cases when states, outside of the Civil War, of course, went to battle to resolve disputes. Funnily enough, this wasn't really one of those times. In fact, the Toledo War arguably shouldn't be called a war at all, considering there were no real casualties. On top of that, there was barely any damage to property, making it a bit of an ongoing joke among the people of the Midwest. After the virtually bloodless war had come to an end, the new state border was established at approximately the 41° 44' north latitude line, just north of the mouth of the Maumee River. Oddly enough, the line continued across the Ottawa River, rendering the peninsula disconnected from the rest of the state, giving it the name Lost Peninsula. From exclave to exclave, we find ourselves at the next geographical oddity, Point Roberts, Washington. This area, with a population of 1,191 according to the 2020 census, is as much a political oddity as it is a geographical one. According to available records, the western United States-Canadian border follows the 49th parallel because of the Oregon Treaty signed on the 15th of June, 1846. The treaty ended a dispute between Britain and the U.S. for claims to the area now known as the Rocky Mountains of Oregon Country. The little piece of the Point Roberts Peninsula was south of the 49th parallel, and thus was placed in the United States, but it's not connected by any land. It was a favored spot for Icelandic immigrants, and they still make up 1/7 of the land residents. At number 22, this is one of the most popular geographic oddities for most people in the United States, as well as a cross-country hotspot for many driving through the West, the Four Corners Monument. Depending on who you ask, this place is either a tourist trap or a site that exemplifies the historical complexities of the time period. At the start, the first boundary was drawn after the Compromise of 1850, a series of bills written to combat rising tensions leading up to the Civil War. It consequently created the New Mexico Territory and Utah Territory, followed by a transfer of land to the newly created Colorado Territory in 1861. When the Confederate States of America were gaining traction with the Arizona Territory, the Union responded by creating another of the same name. The Union definition split New Mexico along a north-south line, the 32nd meridian west from Washington, which simply extended the boundary between Colorado and Utah southward. The Union Plan eventually became reality, and this created the quadrupoint at the modern Four Corners. Today, there are slight differences in the New Mexico boundary, but the Four Corners remain standing as a monument to the rising tensions between the North and South, as well as a fun way to say that you were in four places at once, if you managed to make that famous detour. When we think about these oddities, it's often exclusively domestic issues. But sometimes developments take us to faraway places. In 1590, a Spanish missionary, Fray José de Acosta, came up with an interesting theory regarding a possible land bridge connecting Asia to North America, as cross-continental migration was a hotly debated issue at the time. Now, although a majority of this belief has since been dismissed, we do know that there is a period of time when Russia and the US were at least partially connected. It's called the Bering Strait, an ice bridge that is often said to close the 53-mile gap, at its narrowest point, between America and Siberia. It's inspired quite a few bizarre discussions between the two countries. In April of 2007, Russian government officials told the press that the Russian government would back a $65 billion plan by a consortium of companies to build a Bering Strait tunnel. But as you know, relations between the US and Russia are not exactly what we'd call amicable at this point, and thus the project has never come to fruition. Next up, we're taking a look at Michigan's Upper Peninsula, or as many Midwesterners call it, the UP, a 16,377 square mile landmass bordering 3 Great Lakes, as well as the north of Wisconsin. One quick look at this gem is enough to make anyone scratch their head, as it doesn't appear to make much sense why this territory doesn't belong to the Cheese Kings. Well, once again, we need only look at the silly conflict known as the Toledo War. This conflict between Michigan and Ohio was full of idle threats. In this case, the two sides' militias started trying to ruffle feathers. They shot at the air, which in today's day and age is known as duck hunting, prompting President Jackson to push the affair to a swift conclusion. In the end, Ohio ended up with the Toledo Strip to stop the state from its effort to prevent Michigan's statehood. In a rather strange trade, Michigan received the Upper Peninsula. At the start, it seemed like a bum deal, but the following decades proved otherwise, as Michigan was left with an abundance of natural resources. Our final oddity is a physical one that really needs no introduction, as it has been frequently referenced at different points of this wavy list. This would be none other than the Mississippi River. One of the world's major river systems in size, habitat diversity, and biological productivity, it is renowned for its cultural and commercial significance throughout the United States of America. From songs to movies to great works of literature, the Mississippi River is a natural beacon to all those blessed to be in its presence. Flowing 2,350 miles from Lake Itasca in Minnesota, the river powers a significant segment of the economy in the upper Midwest. Barges and their tows move approximately 175 million tons of freight each year on the upper Mississippi through a system of 29 locks and dams. It's also a major recreational resource for boaters, canoeists, hunters, anglers, and birdwatchers, and offers many outdoor opportunities. On top of that, it pumps through Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, of course, and Louisiana, and has been used to draw the borders between a majority of the territories connected to it. Quoting Mark Twain, "The Mississippi River will always have its own way. No engineering skill can persuade it to do otherwise." We hope you've enjoyed these 25 geographical oddities of the US. Their presence exemplifies the rich diversity to be found in this relatively young country, as well as, in some cases, how humanity finds a way to reach compromise with the most unique solutions. Are there any oddities you'd like to learn about more, or any that we missed in this list? Let us know in the comments below. Now check out some other videos, such as the real reason ships don't pass under South America, or why one of the USA's biggest lakes is reappearing centuries after disappearing. Thanks for watching.